Old pond, a frog jumps in, the sound of water. 17 syllables, probably the 3 most famous lines of poetry Japan has ever produced. You have likely seen them on a postcard, a coffee mug, or 1,000 competing translations credited to a poet named Matsuo Basho. Almost no one who quotes it knows why it was radical. In Basho's Japan, serious poetry meant cherry blossoms, the moon, the echoes of emperors and courtiers long dead. A frog and a splash were not poetry. They were beneath it. He wrote it anyway. And with 17 syllables about almost nothing, he quietly rewrote what a Japanese poem was allowed to be. To understand that poem, start decades earlier with a boy who was not born a poet. Matsuo Basho was born in 1644 in Iga province, son of a low-ranking samurai family with little land and less standing. As a young man, he served a local lord's son, Todo Yoshitada, not as a warrior, but as a companion in haikai, a playful, often comic form of linked verse popular among samurai and merchants alike. They studied and wrote together. In 1666, Yoshitada died at 25. Basho was 22. He left samurai service, no dramatic renunciation is recorded, but he never returned to conventional employment. He drifted toward Edo, scraping together a living teaching and judging haikai for a fee. By the early 1680s, he had students of his own. One gave him a gift he came to love more than anything else at his simple hut, a small banana tree planted outside his window. The plant was called basho in Japanese, unshowy, bearing no edible fruit in that climate, its broad leaves torn easily by the wind. Basho wrote of it with visible affection, comparing its fragility to his own. He took its name as his own. Matsuo Munafusa, minor poet of minor origins, became Matsuo Basho, remembered centuries later by the name of a banana tree outside a hut on the edge of Edo. By 1686, Basho was leading his own school of haikai in Edo, and one spring evening, at a small gathering in his banana tree hut, he tried out a verse that broke almost every expectation the form carried. Haikai poetry in that era leaned on centuries of borrowed elegance, the cry of a warbler, cherry blossoms scattering, the moon over a famous shrine, echoes of court poets 1,000 years dead. A poet proved his skill by handling those inherited images gracefully. Basho offered his students an old pond instead, a frog, a jump, a sound of water breaking the stillness, then silence again. No classical allusion, no famous place, no clever wordplay stacking one borrowed image on another. Only a plain moment observed with total attention, not what the pond looked like, but the single sound it made and the deeper quiet that followed. It was a deliberate argument, made in 17 syllables, that poetry did not require ornament to matter, that an old pond and a frog were exactly as worthy of a poem as the moon over a palace, if a poet paid close enough attention to render them true. The style that grew from this became known as shofu, Basho's way, built on sabi, a weathered stillness, and karumi, a lightness that found depth in ordinary things. The word haiku, as used worldwide today, would not exist for another 200 years, coined later to describe poems in this newly independent 3-line form Basho helped establish. In his own lifetime, he simply called it haiku. The frog poem was not an isolated experiment. By the time he wrote it, Basho had already been walking. Starting in 1684, he made a series of journeys on foot through Japan, later writing them up as travel diaries interwoven with haikai. Nozarashi Kiko, record of a weather-exposed skeleton, among the earliest. The title tells you how he thought about the road, as something that might leave his bones bleaching in a ditch, not as a pleasant excursion. This was not simple stubbornness. Basho had studied Zen Buddhism, and its idea that clinging to comfort was the source of suffering shaped his travel. Almost nothing carried, sleeping where he could, each temple and mountain pass treated as a single, unrepeatable meeting. Travel in his era was not romantic. Roads were poor, and weather and illness killed travelers every year. The Tokugawa government maintained checkpoints, or sakisho, and a wanderer without proper papers could be turned back, or worse. In the spring of 1689, at 45, already older than many men of his time, Basho set out from Edo with a single companion, his student Kawai Sora, on the journey that would define his legacy. A walking circuit of roughly 2,400 kilometers through the wild interior and northern provinces of Japan. Before he left, he gave up his hut. By his own account, he prepared as a man who did not expect to make it back. The journey took about 150 days, on foot and by whatever boat or horse could be arranged, through terrain ranging from famous shrines to trails barely used by anyone. At Hiraizumi, now Iwate Prefecture, Basho stood where the northern Fujiwara clan and the tragic general Minamoto no Yoshitsune had made their last stand 500 years before. A stronghold so completely erased that only summer grass remained where a fortress had stood. He wrote one of his most quoted lines there, "Natsukusa ya tsuwamonodomo ga yume no ato." Summer grasses, all that remains of soldiers' dreams. It is the closest this peaceful poet ever came to writing about war, not the fighting, but what it leaves behind, as grass. At Matsushima, famous for centuries as one of Japan's finest views, Basho is said to have been so overwhelmed that he wrote nothing at all that night, a story his students preserved because it was so unlike him, though modern scholars treat it as likely embellished. The physical cost was real. Sora's own notes, more matter-of-fact than Basho's, record illness, exhaustion, and days lost to bad weather. Basho was, by most accounts, not a physically robust man. At 45, walking mountain trails in every condition, he was pushing a body that may already have been failing him. He did not treat any of it as suffering to be endured for a reward at the end. Each ordinary stop, a farmhouse, a temple, a fellow poet's room for the night, was written up with the same attention as the famous sights, because that was the entire point, not the destination, but paying full attention to wherever he actually was. Basho finished the walk at Ogaki in the autumn of 1689, roughly 5 months and 2,400 kilometers after leaving Edo, expecting perhaps never to return. He had returned. Over the next several years, he revised the account into its final form. Oku no Hosomichi, the narrow road to the deep north. A carefully shaped work of prose and verse that turned one man's walk into one of the most read works in Japanese literature. He kept traveling and teaching, refining his style once more in his final years toward what he called karumi, lightness. Poems that found meaning in the plainest, everyday details. It was the frog poem's logic taken further, less reaching for profundity, more simply seeing clearly. In the autumn of 1694, on another journey, this one to Osaka, he fell ill. He was 50. Surrounded by students, he composed a final haiku, as poets of his era were expected to before death, Tabi ni yande yume wa kareno wo kakemaguru. Sick on a journey, my dreams go wandering over withered fields. He died days later, still on the road. That poem is worth sitting with, not that his dreams had ended, but that even as his body failed, they kept moving, across empty fields, toward nowhere in particular, the way he had walked for years, toward no destination more important than the walking itself. That same restless attention is what made him famous in the first place. An old pond, a frog, a sound of water, most poets of his century would have considered too small to notice. Basho built a life, and in the end, a philosophy, on the discipline of noticing anyway. 300 years later, people who have never read a line of Oku no Hosomichi still know his frog. Few know it took a lifetime of walking to write those 17 syllables. Now you do. If this story was worth your time, subscribe. Forgotten Japan tells the stories that the famous tales of samurai and shoguns leave out.